Nate was called out, which surprised him. There were 3 men sitting in front of him. One of them noted that he asked a question about how he purifies water. Pointing his finger with a smile on his face, the protagonist replied that he uses a special purifier that the government developed. Sitting at the table, the man noted that this was good and said that they were moving on to the next question. Looking at the piece of paper, he asked why Nate chose their company. Smiling, the protagonist did not know what to answer. Putting his hand on the table, the man said that they looked at his resume, noting that the protagonist did not list any talents or anything else. He asked to be honest, did not Nate himself think it was a waste of time? They sat opposite each other. Taken aback, the protagonist asked again. Hitting his finger on the table, the man noted that he was talking. He put his fist to his face and said that Nate was coming to an interview at a big company and he couldn't do anything. The protagonist asked why they had posted the job in that case. The man replied that they had done so because they were required to by the law against discrimination against the untalented. He slammed his finger on the table again and said that the reality was different. Clenching his hand into a fist, Nate wondered if this was the same old story about the untalented. He imagined a ring with an abyss in the center. The protagonist mentally noted that after the world learned about the dungeon, people discovered unprecedented potential in themselves. He imagined the outline of a crowd of people. Nate noted that they called him talent, and he, in turn, led to a sharp leap in civilization. He told us that someone said that the discovery of talent was a blessing for humanity. The protagonist emphasized that he believed it himself. He imagined himself chained up and added that he believed it until he realized that he had no talent. The man crossed his arms and said that their company was about making a profit and that untalented people like the main character were useless to them. The guy with glasses said that he had no talent and asked if he had a conscience. Nate sighed loudly. He asked with a displeased face if they were aware that they were currently engaging in real discrimination. The man, taken aback, asked what he was talking about. The main character asked what they had meant by that. They looked at the displeased Nate and started shouting that they were tired of people like him. They asked what position he had if he had no talent. The main character nodded silently. Sitting in front of them, he asked if it was a crime to expect human treatment. Looking at them, he asked them to apologize. The guys asked with evil grins if Nate shouldn't apologize for wasting their time. The main character stood up from his chair and said that it meant they weren't going to apologize. He showed the tape recorder and said that he had recorded everything. He grinned and said that it contained both obvious discrimination against the untalented and an admission of posting non-existent vacancies. Holding his glasses, the guy started laughing and offered to defuse the situation. The main character started to leave from there, and the guys tried to catch up with him, shouting that they didn't mean that they weren't going to apologize. He hit the guy on the arm. Standing at the exit, Nate said that he would see what the Human Rights Commission would say about everything they said. The 3 guys were dumbfounded by his words. Daylight enveloped the building. Leaving the building, the main character said that just because he didn't have talent didn't mean he didn't have pride. He looked at his phone and read the notification that his request to the Human Rights Commission had been reviewed. Straightening his tie, Nate said that it was for the good of humanity and asked, how else? He suddenly stepped on gum on the ground. Trying to tear his leg off, he said that if people chew their gum, they should at least throw it away somewhere. He was suddenly doused with water. Surprised people looked at him and asked for forgiveness. Drops of water ran down Nate's face. Looking at the sky, he asked what kind of day it was. Evening light enveloped the main character's house. He entered it. He went to the window. Wiping the wall and the floor, Nate said that the alcoholics had dirtied his entire window again. Wiping the wall, he called his mother and asked how she was. Sitting on the floor with a smile on his face, he asked how she was fed in the hospital. His mother said that it was her fault that he was in trouble. She remarked that if only his uncle would pay her back. Holding the phone to his ear, Nate cried out that he had already told her not to mention that jerk in front of him. His mother responded that he was his uncle and that she shouldn't talk about him like that. Holding out his hand, the protagonist said that if he was the type to pay back debts, he would have already paid it back. He assumed that his uncle had already moved abroad. Putting his hand to his face, he said that he was not angry and apologized for being angry. Sitting against the wall, Nate asked her not to worry, noting that he had a college degree and a cool resume, so he would do well. He looked at the many bills on his desk and said that she didn't have to worry about them. While talking on the phone, he said that he was doing well and that they would call each other again. He started walking up the stairs. He took out a pack of cigarettes. Lighting a cigarette, the protagonist said that this was the only joy in life. Suddenly, it started to rain. Furious, Nate looked up at the sky. He threw away the lighter. Looking up at the sky, he said that at least this could have been left behind, noting that he was already struggling to live. Throwing up his hands, he asked why God was always against him. The protagonist mentally noted that he didn't care if God existed. Pounding the ground with his fist, he said that he didn't want to live like this and it wasn't his fault. Placing his hands on the ground, he screamed that someone had to be held accountable for this. The protagonist informed us that at that moment, he was taking his anger out on God. He asked if that was the reason. Suddenly, lightning struck. He pointed his finger at the sky and asked what he wanted. Frowning, the protagonist asked God to bite him. Lightning struck him. Falling to the ground, Nate asked if he was dead, adding that his worthless life had come to an end. He lay in a puddle. He thought about what would happen to his mother if he died. He opened his eyes. He looked at the bright light. Lying on the ground, the protagonist asked if he was alive. He looked at the blue projection in the sky that he had a new vacancy. Looking at the notification, he was surprised. He stared at the message and asked what the hell was this. A notification popped up that the gods were waiting for him. It was raining outside. Drops of water were running down the wall. Nate mentally asked if God existed. He was sitting on the floor with a towel on his head. The protagonist mentally noted that he was struck by lightning for insulting God, although he was not even sure of his existence. He looked at his phone. Nate wondered if this was what they call heavenly punishment. Looking at his hands, the protagonist noted that usually people after being struck by lightning are either in serious condition or even die, but he did not have a scratch. He looked at the message that there was a new job opening for him. The protagonist noted that if anything had changed, it was the strange notification hovering above his head. Holding his fist to his face, Nate noted that this was something that people with talent usually saw. Taken aback, he wondered if the lightning had awakened his talent. He mentally asked if he should check it out. He held his hand to his face and turned to the window. He looked at the message that had not changed at all. Frowning, he asked what it was if not a window. The protagonist asked why it looked like a notification for a part-time job. He looked at the bright light in surprise. The bright light was coming from the signs in front of him. Many projections surrounded him. He asked if this was really a part-time job. He said with a smile on his face that in real life, whatever, his lot was only a part-time job. The smile disappeared from his face. Nate frowned, noting that he would think positively and that he had nothing to lose, so he would take this opportunity. He looked at the projection that said that the job openings were loading. He talked about how it was a part-time job for the gods and asked if there was even a sorting option. He touched the notification and said that he would look. The sign in front of him turned red and a message popped up that he did not have enough divine power. He wondered what divine power was. He looked at the message that said that divine power was a common name for the power used by the gods. Sighing, he asked how he would get divine power if he had no talent. Putting his hand to his chin, Nate thought about how he did not have a bad feeling and maybe this was his chance to change his life. He touched the projection and thought about how it reminded him of a headhunter. Taken aback, he began reading the vacancies that did not require divine power. He clicked on the vacancy for creating Midgard dungeons. A notice appeared in front of him that workers were urgently needed to create dungeons. The employer was Thor, no divine power was required, no work experience was required. The description said that creating Midgard dungeons was not a difficult job if you were hardworking and diligent, and they could consider lower level gods. He imagined many monsters and wondered if it was necessary to create dungeons that were teeming with monsters. Dumbfounded, the protagonist asked if the gods created the dungeons and whether he should believe it. He saw that the salary was 12 Thors. Holding his face, Nate asked how much that was in their money. He pressed the respond button and guessed that the currency of the gods was worth its weight in gold. Smiling, he said that he would not waste time. A bright stream of energy came from the sky. Blue mana hit a tree. Nate held onto the tree. He walked out of the portal. His face was dumbfounded. He asked where he was. While looking around, the protagonist asked how he got there. Surprised, Nate said that he had never seen anything like this in his life and asked if he was asleep. The monster stood behind him and rushed at him. The protagonist turned around. He saw the monster attacking him. The demon began to roar loudly. The protagonist covered his face with his hands. Suddenly, someone grabbed the monster by the neck. Surprised, Nate looked at the man who was enveloped in blue mana. The man looked at the monster and asked where his manners were. He turned his gaze. Looking at the dumbfounded Nate, he asked if he was new. The plot introduces us to Thor, the god of thunder and lightning in Scandinavian mythology. Thor smiled and introduced himself. He put his hand on the protagonist's shoulder and assumed that Nate knew who he was. Thor grabbed the protagonist and said that he had a lot to do, so they would talk on the go. Nate looked at him and mentally noted that he was a big guy with a shaggy beard. He looked at Thor's face and wondered if it was Mjolnir. Taken aback, the protagonist mentally asked if it was really Thor. The god of thunder pointed at him and said that by the looks of it, he was one of the gods of the east. Surprised, Nate mentally asked if Thor thought he was a god. He looked at the guys around him and noted that he no longer knew what kind of gods they were, but they were definitely not humans. Frowning, the protagonist assumed that he was the only human there. Smiling, Nate replied that he was the guardian of a small mountain. Thor began to smile widely and said that he had heard of him and asked if they usually helped people in trouble. Looking at him, Thor assumed that Nate was very imbued with human culture. The dumbfounded protagonist looked at his clothes. Nate walked next to him and said that he often descended into the world of people to find out how he could help. Thor replied that he cared about them very much. He asked if he was okay with that. The protagonist looked at him in surprise. Thor smirked and said that his job now was to create places where people suffered. The protagonist looked away and said that he was okay with that. As they walked up the steps, Thor asked if he had heard of the Minotaur's labyrinth. He smirked and said that then Nate would quickly understand what was going on. The protagonist began to look around. He saw a bright light. Many birds flew in front of him. Thor pointed to the dungeon and said that the Minotaur's labyrinth was just taken as a basis. He smirked and looked at the surprised Nate and said that he would be building the labyrinth with them. A man stood behind him and asked why he was yawning, noting that they had a lot of work to do. Looking at the huge gate, Nate replied that he was coming. He was told that they needed carts to Sector E6. The protagonist climbed out of the pit and said that he was coming. They shouted that help was needed at Sector A1. Nate got up from the table and replied that he was already coming. He said with a distraught look that he was already there. The guy looked at the protagonist and asked if he was working hard. He asked him not to fall through. Turning around, Nate with a smile on his face asked to get him out if he fell through. Looking at the many boxes, the man said that that was all for today. The protagonist clarified if they were finished. The red orc said with a smile that it was a great job and asked how he liked it. Nate replied that it was just physical work. Leaving from there, the orc said that everything was sorted there, so they would go to the cart, catch their breath, and then go to the next point. Sitting in the cart, the orc asked if everyone in the east was so enthusiastic. The protagonist asked if it was true that everything depended on character. Looking at the smiling Nate, the orc said that he was already being praised there. The protagonist replied that he was embarrassed. He thought with a smile on his face that he was very sociable. He looked at the orc with a grin and asked about talent, noting that communication with the gods would bring much more benefit. Raising his hand, the orc said that they were getting out and would go from there. He lightly hit the large monster that was pulling the cart and noted that if they trusted him, all the mines along the way would be demolished. The orc looked at Nate, who was carrying a box, and screamed loudly for him to watch where he was stepping. He pointed to a magic symbol on the ground and said that it meant that there was a mine there. The orc started pointing at the floor and said that there were mines there. Turning around, he asked if Nate had never seen them, adding that it would teach him a lesson. Carrying the box, he said that the protagonist probably knew that lately the higher gods demand that people pass some kind of entrance exams before hiring them, and lower level gods like them are not supposed to do this, so they do this kind of work. Smiling, he told them that the dungeons are constantly being built, so they have a lot of work to do. Nate asked again if they are constantly being built. The protagonist saw several workers, and the orc said that they started creating a room a couple of minutes ago and have already finished. He asked Nate to go and see. The protagonist's face was dumbfounded. Looking at the huge room with columns, he asked if they had built this in a couple of minutes. Frowning, the protagonist asked how they built such a colossus. Nate put the box on the ground. The orc opened it and said that there was something in there that would make this place a real challenge. They looked into the box. The protagonist tapped the cocoon and asked if it was a round stone. The orc replied that it could be, and it looked like a normal stone, but spiders would come out of it. Pointing to the many cocoons, he said that when they all hatched, this place would be a real headache. Looking into the box, the protagonist asked what kind of monster it was. They looked at a huge lizard that was tied up. The orc asked if Nate had heard of them, noting that it was a lizardman. Putting his finger up, the protagonist asked why that part was transparent. The orc asked him to be careful, adding that he was not ready yet, and besides, it was a vital point. Nate replied with a smile that he did not know that. The orc suggested that they go to the next room. Pointing with his hand, he told them that goblins were hiding there. As the protagonist walked down the dark corridor, the orc said that those who made it that far would essentially be at the finish line. The protagonist suddenly looked down. He saw a monster. He was looking at the goblin's face. The monster suddenly opened its eyes. It lunged at Nate. The monster grabbed its head. The orc began to laugh loudly and asked if the protagonist was scared, noting that the goblin was just fooling around. Looking at the monster, the orc said that once the construction was finished, it would be a different matter, noting that goblins were very smart creatures, so they were difficult to deal with. Nate frowned and said that was for sure. He looked at the huge head of the bull and mentally noted that this was the end of the labyrinth. The orc pointed to the huge gate. He looked at the bull's head and said that this was where the main boss was. Thor suddenly approached the protagonist and called out to him. Nate and the orc bowed to him. The god of thunder said that he heard that everyone there praised him and asked how work was. The protagonist replied that everything was fine, thanks to his care. Holding his chin, Thor said that he spoke beautifully and asked if all the monsters had already been quartered. Pointing with his hand, the orc said that this was only the very last thing left. Raising his hammer above his head, Thor clarified whether the workday was over in that case. The dumbfounded protagonist asked why the hammer. Thor, with a smile on his face, cried out that Nate was a good boy and next time he would tell him what kind of dungeons he had in the east and wished him a safe journey. Thor hit him with the hammer. The protagonist suddenly teleported. He covered himself with his hands. He lay on the floor and said that this was a strange farewell to work. Nate noted that he already thought that Thor was going to punish him for lying, that he was not a man. Looking at his hand, the protagonist noted that all this was real. Smiling, the protagonist declared that it was not a dream or a hallucination, but a real awakening. He raised his hands and began to shout loudly that he really was awake. A message appeared that his salary had been credited to his account. Frowning, Nate mentally noted that it was a salary. He touched the projection with a trembling hand. A notification appeared about loading the god's shop. Taken aback, the protagonist asked what all this was, adding that it was crazy. Odin's spear, Gungnir, which never misses its target, appeared on the screen. Then a window appeared with the fur armor of the Nemean lion, which neutralizes all physical damage. The next window popped up with Freya's necklace, allowing you to move between dimensions. Nate looked at the screen in surprise and decided that this was really the god's shop. After that, he saw a blue card of Thor's power, a lightning strike, then a red one, the power of Hephaestus, flame, and a green one, giving the power of Ares, destruction. The protagonist looked at the screen in shock and wondered if he could really buy all this. He imagined how people admired him in his gear, and he rejoiced and thought that then he could become a god in a human body. He returned to reality, in which he happily stood with his arms outstretched in front of the fan. Nate turned off the fan. He raised his hand and said with a confident smile that everything was fine. That was the change in his life. Looking at the screen, saying that he did not have enough divine power, he became sad. He sighed desperately, thinking about what he expected. He looked at the red screen with prices and realized that the cheapest was 70,000 tors, which was very expensive. Nate put his fist to his cheek and pressed the screen, thinking about what he could buy. 3 different talents appeared in front of him, which surprised him with a cry. The protagonist grabbed his head and raised an eyebrow, shouting that he could just buy the talent. He was lost in thought, biting his finger, wondering how much it would cost. A window appeared with an SS level talent for 12 tors. Nate was very surprised and brought the screen right to his face, shouting that the powers cost 70,000 and the talent was only 12 tors. He sighed desperately and said that no one was buying it and looked at the comments, which wrote that it was really still being sold. Who needed something that mortals used, and suggested updating the powers section because gods needed powers, not talents. He looked at the screen closely and shouted that they were being impudent. This was SS level. This was not just a talent, but an SS level talent almost for free. He clicked on the fencing talent and happily said its name. Smiling, Nate put his hand to his chin, imagining himself as a little boy with a blade, and said that as a child he liked to play with a sword. He smiled confidently and clicked the buy button, saying that there was nothing to think about, he was buying. A notification appeared that the SS fencing talent had been successfully acquired. He was enveloped in golden light. The protagonist looked at his hands in surprise, which were filling with energy, and asked if it had worked. He clenched his fist in joy and smiled and said that he had worked hard to get at least an F-level talent and had gotten this one so easily. A message appeared with a chest and an inscription congratulating him on his first purchase. Only today there was a 1+1 promotion. He would receive a gift of the same level as his purchase. He covered his mouth with his hand and looked at the screen through tears, wondering if they would really give him another SS level item. There was a screen with 3 talents in front of him. He thought about it and chose a talent for fighting. Nate raised his hand, closed his eyes, and joyfully shouted that he could now use both fencing and fighting. He looked ahead in surprise. The room blurred before his eyes. The protagonist stretched out his hand, but everything was smeared. Nate lay on the floor, exhausted, writhing in pain, thinking that his whole body hurt. He lay twisted on the floor and a notification appeared that his body was being strengthened to use talents. His arm tensed, his veins stood out, the system reported that his lung capacity was increasing. Nate's face was tense, he bared his teeth, a notification appeared about increasing muscle strength. He closed his eyes tighter and tighter while the system said that the body enhancement was successfully completed. He dreamed of his smiling mother, who called Nate by name. She extended her hand with a smile and said that she was sorry and that it was because of her that he had problems. He thought that she was talking about it again. Now everything was fine, he had talent. Nate suddenly thought that he couldn't have this. He woke up lying on the floor and fearfully shouted the word talent twice. The protagonist sat up, rubbed his neck and said that he had a headache, thinking that he had fallen asleep and dreamed of his mother. He was scared and wondered in surprise if it was all a dream. Nate frowned and in fear shouted the word window. The system opened with his data and the position of a low-level god. He looked at her in surprise and said the title and understood that that was why he was able to work in the dungeons. The main character, sitting on the floor, exhaled and said with a smile that he was once untalented and now a god. Life is an unpredictable thing. Looking at the broken phone, he saw that his mother was calling him. He happily brought the phone to his ear and said that he had good news, and she replied that he should not come to the hospital today under any circumstances. He looked at the phone in fear and asked what was the matter, and she said not to come and not to worry about him. Nate stood up and looked into the distance in fear, asking why she did it so suddenly, when suddenly the voice on the phone interrupted, asking if he was his mother's guardian, to which Nate agreed. He was upset and scared when he heard that the situation was serious. He could not tell the main character the details. It seemed that a dungeon had appeared near the hospital. The man continued to say that they tried to call him, but the phone was unavailable. Until the situation improved, they would not be able to receive visitors. Nate threw the phone on the floor, and the man continued to clarify if he could hear him. The protagonist was already running up the stairs, anxiously thinking about his mother. He was very nervous, beads of sweat were running down his face. Lightning appeared above the city and a helicopter was flying. The military filled the city, engulfed in a storm. On the news, a frightened female reporter said that they had arrived at the scene, as they could see signs of the appearance of a dungeon everywhere. The military man frowned and shouted into the loudspeaker that they could not go there, everyone should step back. A taxi drove up. A frightened Nate emerged from it, holding onto the door. He watched as a crowd of people listened to the military man standing on the bus with a loudspeaker. The protagonist watched tensely and thought about what was happening. A notification appeared about the activation of the A-level concentration skill. Nate looked from afar at the crowd of people and the man shouting to step back. He looked closer at the military man pointing with his hand where to go. The protagonist was able to see his face and thought about how he could see his face so well from afar. He looked away in surprise and heard someone say that the government was calling all hunters. 2 military men looked at each other and talked about how there were 8-star hunters here, and this time the dungeon was especially dangerous. Nate stood in the center of the crowd, confused, and heard absolutely everyone talking. He grabbed his head in fear and wondered if this was really concentration or if it was because of the talents he had bought before. The protagonist looked anxiously into the crowd and decided that there was no time to think, he had to get to the hospital. Making his way through the crowd of people, pushing them aside, he turned to the military man with a megaphone and said that his mother was there and he had to go through. To which he replied that he couldn't, there were signs that they were dealing with a labyrinth and couldn't let him through. Nate frowned and looked at him, thinking about the labyrinth. He looked at the clouds covered in lightning. The soldier turned around, and the protagonist leaned over anxiously and looked at the sky. Nate watched as an energy flow appeared from the cloud directly into the crowd of people who were running away in fear. He bared his teeth and barely made his way through the huge crowd of people running in fear. He fell, holding the ground with his hands and bowing his head among the rubble. Nate put his fist to his chin and opened one eye and asked what was happening. The protagonist looked forward in fear. A huge portal appeared in the middle of the city. He was scared and looked in surprise. The portal became clearer, it was surrounded by runes, and inside he could see a city. Nate looked in surprise and shouted that this was the dungeon he was building. Inside the dungeon, there were creatures who were building buildings. The protagonist remembered how he put a pick on his shoulder and said that the view from there was really cool. He placed his hands on his hips and exhaled, thinking about what he hadn't understood until now. Standing in front of the sparkling portal, he looked inside in fear and thought that he never thought he would see it here. Nate continued to look at it in fear and wonder why the dungeon was here. He looked in surprise at the man coughing at his feet. The protagonist threw his arm over his shoulder and helped him walk, asking if he was okay, to which he replied that they needed to leave quickly. Nate looked tensely to the side and pushed the man away. They flew apart. The protagonist looked in fear at the sword that flew into the wall. He turned around and heard a strange sound. The dying man desperately told him to run. The man fell to the ground and a lizard came out to him. Nate sat on the ground in fear and watched as the monster stepped on the man's corpse, holding a knife in its paw. The lizardman raised his sword in the air, kneeling on one knee, and other lizardmen began to run out. The soldiers armed themselves and listened to the order of one of them to open fire. The lizardmen ran forward, covering themselves from the shots. Nate hid behind a car from the shells and covered himself with his hands, shouting that there was a man there. The monster with a sword furiously ran straight at the sitting protagonist. He swung the blade. Nate screamed in fear, sitting on the ground. A notification appeared about the activation of the A-level concentration skill. The protagonist looked up and energy appeared from his eyes. The monster threw the sword at him, but Nate felt a flow of energy. He concentrated on the blade and the lizard. The protagonist touched the ground, looked at the tip flying at him and sharply raised his hand. The sword was approaching his face. He looked on in confusion as he grabbed the blade mid-flight. Looking at the sword in his hand, Nate was very surprised. The protagonist grabbed his hand and screamed in panic, surprised that he caught it. He looked to the side warily. There was a man sitting next to him, and the lizardman swung again. The man was writhing in pain, and Nate was screaming to be careful. The protagonist bared his teeth in fury and was indignant, looking at the monster, the soldier, and the man. He stood up and ran. With a scream, Nate aggressively pounced right on the lizardman. Two soldiers saw this, one shouted into the radio to hold off, since there was a civilian there, and the other was surprised that it was not a hunter. They watched as Nate was surrounded by monsters and said that even if it was a hunter, he was unarmored there. The protagonist raised two fists and thought fearfully that he had acted on emotions, but now, what should he do? The lizardman swung his sword at the crying and apologizing Nate with a scream. A message appeared about the activation of the A-level concentration talent. He dodged sharply and was surprised by this. Nate smiled in fear. The protagonist turned around and saw the lizardman running after him. He dodged again with his legs and arms spread, thinking that this was the concentration skill, and it was as if he had drunk 100 cups of coffee. Looking at the lizardmen, Nate decided that he could see their movements very clearly. He quickly ran away. The protagonist clenched his fist in front of the screaming monster, who swung his sword. He confidently moved his fist to the side. A notification appeared about the activation of the SS level battle talent. Nate beat him with all his might on the torso, legs, and jaw. He stood on one leg, flames came out of his hand, and the lizardman flew back. The protagonist looked forward in surprise and realized that he had succeeded. Nate, surrounded by monsters, took a fighting stance and raised his fist, deciding that there were two left. The lizardman tried to strike with a scream. The protagonist deftly dodged, leaning on the ground. He looked at the monster insistently. Nate moved his leg to the side. The guy kicked with all his might right at the lizardman's jaw. Another monster was running at him. He slid his sword along the asphalt. Nate noticed that the lizardman was running up behind him. He struck with his sword, when suddenly, the protagonist disappeared in front of him. The monster roared, looking up. Nate flew right above the lizardman's head. The protagonist delivered a powerful kick from above, stomping the monster's head into the ground. The military looked at this in shock and said that this was impossible. The man watched as the protagonist stood in the middle of 3 lizardman corpses and said that he had just laid out a lizardman with his bare hands. The soldier turned to see the sighing old man next to him. Nate turned around in surprise to see the man calling him over with a smile and asking what guild he was from. The old man walked up to Nate. He was accompanied by people in cloaks. Others were fighting monsters behind him. He said that his face was unfamiliar, but he was good. The head of the Sangun Guild, Chuck, extended his hand and introduced himself with a smile. They shook hands and Chuck said that it was unlikely that a hunter who was a member of the guild would come here alone, then asked if he was working alone, to which Nate agreed. The man turned around, pointing his hand back and said that they had come to clear this dungeon and called him with them, which surprised the protagonist. He looked at the portal to the dungeon and thought that now he was no longer an ordinary person. The protagonist looked at the hospital behind the portal and decided that if he did not stop the monsters now, they would continue to appear. He clenched his fist and said it was a simple matter. Nate approached the smiling Chuck and confidently said that they should go forward. They entered the cave. The protagonist touched the wall. Turning to the man and the rest of the guild members, he said that they should go there. Chuck turned to the man behind him. Nate looked at the blade in the man's hand and thought that thank God he remembered all the moves, of course, all thanks to the fact that he walked along them hundreds of times. He approached Chuck and asked him to wait, to which the old man asked what was going on. Nate looked confidently and said that he would lead from there. One of the guild members was indignant and said that this was nonsense, and he had no idea where he came from, but he should know his place. The protagonist stood in front of Chuck and said that further on there were traps and mines, that's why he was talking. The man folded his arms and laughed, thanking them for their concern and adding that he thought the advanced team had already taken care of everything. Nate picked up a rock from the ground and asked, "Is that so?" He knelt down and threw the rock forward. The rock approached the ground. Suddenly, a trap cut it into many pieces. The guild leader and members looked at this in surprise, and Nate said that he was sure that the advanced team was not here yet. He pointed his finger at the blue plate and said that this trap was activated by pressure. Introducing a sharp spear, the protagonist explained that the swords were cast from a special alloy. They would pierce most armor like some kind of foam. Everything is simple, but much more dangerous than they think. The old man scratched his chin and looked at the confused Nate and asked how he knew all this, and the guy decided that they should not know that he helped build it. He raised his hand to his face and said fearfully that it was a company secret. The protagonist walked confidently ahead, and behind him, Chuck pointed back. Nate stopped. He reached out for the torch on the wall, which surprised the old man. The protagonist frowned and looked away, saying that it would be even more dangerous. He walked forward, raising the torch up. Chuck and the guild members looked ahead in fear. Nate lit the door with a picture of a spider and told everyone to get ready. The guy crushed a huge black spider with his foot and then shouted for it to die. He looked at his dirty boot with displeasure and said that it had stained all his clothes. His comrade added that at this rate they would all get marinated. To which his friend replied that he slept during the briefing. The web that was everywhere here, not only their connection, but also traps, it was easier to burn. Then another guy leaned over to his comrade and whispered that it was that guy who said that. Can they trust him? What if he is a spy from another guild who is trying to disrupt their operation? The protagonist smiled and replied that he heard everything. Then, frowning, he looked around the corner. In front of him appeared a huge hall, which was filled with cobwebs. Then Nate thought that this was the room. Here he unloaded a bunch of spider eggs, but there is no point in complicating things. He will just burn everything to hell. Then he smiled and used a lighter. The guys following him said that everything here is covered in cobwebs. They need to burn it all to the ground. Then one of them brought a torch to the cobwebs. A system message appeared in front of the protagonist that the concentration skill was activated. He looked forward menacingly, and in front of him appeared an image of a man who was entangled in a cobweb. A second later, he grabbed his masked comrade by the shoulder and shouted for him to stop. Lowering his head, he added that they would not be able to control the fire. Menacingly looking ahead, he said that there was a man here. We are transported to an elderly man who is walking past the squad. He says that signs of survivors were found in the stone chamber. Now their priority is to save them. Frowning, he adds that as soon as they enter, they should form a defensive position. They do not know what condition the survivors are in, so they should refrain from further attacks. Then Chuck narrowed his eyes. He looked at the protagonist and said that he does not know how exactly, but this young man seems to know where the survivors are. The support group is acting under his command. Hearing this, Nate was very surprised and thought about how he suddenly appoints him as a commander, but he has never done anything like this. A girl in a dark cape passed by the other guys. Meanwhile, the protagonist, putting his palm forward, asked to wait a little when suddenly someone called out to him. Nate turned around and looked ahead in surprise. In front of him was a girl who, putting her hand forward, said that thanks to him they had reached this place without touching a single mine. She was counting on him. He looked at the hand extended to him in surprise for a few seconds, and then, shaking it, he replied that they would do their best, but there was a problem. The girl, without waiting for an answer, told him not to worry so much about the decrees. He could just tell them where the survivors were, and they would figure out the rest. It would be easier for everyone. The protagonist looked ahead in surprise, then asked what. He scratched his head in confusion, and then asked again, more simply. Then, smiling, he asked if maybe she would let go of his hand already, to which the girl replied that he did not use weapons. He added that he had never tried it, and the girl, looking ahead, replied that so that's how it is. Then, turning around abruptly, she replied that it wouldn't hurt for him to have a sword, or even two. Adjusting her hood, she added that she would go then. The protagonist, looking at her with displeasure, wondered what she wanted to say and left. Then, looking around with interest, he thought that she had called him by name. Then Chuck, looking at the students, shouted that they were leaving and that everyone should take their positions. After a while, we are transferred to the hall. Chuck, along with the protagonist and other students, enter the dungeon. One of the students looks ahead in surprise and says that it is very quiet here. Meanwhile, Chuck turns around and, frowning, replies that they should not lose their vigilance. A second later, Nate, raising his head, shouted that there was a threat from above. Two huge red spiders were climbing from below. Someone shouted why they were so huge. One of the students, fearfully holding his sword in front of him, shouted that he needed help. Chuck, swinging his axe, headed towards him, and then, making a quick dash forward, he chopped the beetle's body into several pieces. Afterwards, he menacingly thrust his axes in front of him and shouted for them not to get lost and investigate the plan. Nate and the other students ran forward. Shouts could be heard everywhere that they needed to form a defensive position and avoid contact with the poison. Then the protagonist looked forward. A blue aura appeared around his eye. Ahead, he saw a blue stream of energy that led him straight. Suddenly, the stream turned to the side. Looking around the corner, Nate saw several cocoons and then shouted that he had finally found them. He saw people covered in webs and then added that there were survivors here. Coming closer, the students began to cut the cocoons with a dagger. Looking at the man, one of them asked that he was okay, let him hold on, there was only a little bit left. Suddenly, several more spiders appeared in the room. Nate threw one person on his back and, turning around, said that he knew a safe place, let them follow him. He frowned menacingly, turned around, and then thought about what doubts were tormenting him. He cut a huge spider outside the window in an instant, from which green poison squirted. Then, looking to the side, he said that the guy knew the passages and structure of the dungeon and even where to look for surviving people. Looking at how he was saving the survivors, he continued to think that a talent he had never heard of. Meanwhile, one of the students, holding a piece of paper in his hand, shouted that there were injured people from the dungeon. Then he approached the commander and said that all the survivors were evacuated. There were victims, but the injuries were minimal, he replied, smiling. That this was a good start, let them continue in the same spirit with those who can still fight, and he will pass it on to the others and tell them to rest. Then, frowning, he looked at the protagonist and said that he would like to talk to him. Nate pointed at himself in surprise and asked what was on him. Then he stood up and took a few steps forward. One of the students, clenching his teeth, looked ahead with displeasure. The protagonist continued to walk forward. Looking at the wounded, he said that taking into account the 2 police officers and hunters, a total of 10 people were trapped, among them were members of their advance team. The commander smiled broadly and then said that if it weren't for him, they would have burned them all and then left. Nate scratched his head, laughed, and replied that they shouldn't thank him. The commander continued to say that, by the way, he has some talent. You'd think that he built this dungeon with his own hands. Hearing this, the protagonist turned pale, but did not stop smiling, and then shouted that such a thing was possible. He started throwing up his hands and shouting that he wasn't some kind of god to build a dungeon. The commander, looking at him, laughed and replied that he was, of course, joking. Nate continued to look ahead and smile, then said that they needed to quickly gather everyone and continue, and then thought about the fact that he thought that he was already finished. A huge stone door appeared in front of them. One of the students, looking ahead, asked what it was from the Inca civilization. The protagonist, looking ahead, answered that there were goblins. One of the students, looking at the door, laughed, said that there were just goblins. Then he looked at the protagonist and said that he thought there would be a boss next, another guy next to him, that he even felt sad somehow. Nate, looking menacingly ahead, thought about the dominance of goblins, how to deal with them. He just can't get it into his head. He hopes that the concentration skill can help. Then he put his hand on his chest and told everyone to listen. It was okay if you went in there alone. One of the students poked him in the shoulder and said that their head praised him so much that he believed in himself. As for the goblins, he was with Chuck here, he shouldn't worry about it. If he was scared, he could wait here. Chuck walked up to him and folded his arms and said that he didn't really like sending him out there alone either. To which Nate, holding out his hand, replied that then he had no choice, then they would have to listen to him when they got inside. Chuck folded his arms and said that it seemed like he had some kind of plan. One of the students gritted his teeth and thought that he wanted to use this opportunity to impress the head, but because of some idiot, he wouldn't be able to stand out. To his comrade, he continued to think that he couldn't let him steal his moment of glory. Then he raised his spear and said that they would go inside them. A few seconds later, they entered a huge empty hall. Looking around, the students asked that there was no one here. Looking ahead, someone said that it was just an empty hallway. Nate turned around and, raising his finger, told them to speak more quietly and then thought that he felt something inside. One of the students smiled sarcastically, looking ahead, and then, going inside, he said that it looked like there was nothing here, or a huge cockroach would crawl out on them now. Another guy, laughing, said that if there were goblins here, then he should stay closer so that they would cover his ass. Suddenly, 2 torches appeared from somewhere. Nate, frowning, heard shouts to quickly turn on the lights, to which he shouted for them to stop, and at the moment this cannot be done. The guy, blushing in the pitch darkness, said that he was talking, they need to see something to fight, and how can he call himself a hunter if he is so afraid of goblins? And then the guy turned on the flashlight and added that the cowards can just stay behind. A second later, the protagonist screamed, opening his mouth in fear so that everyone fell down. Chuck grabbed his students by the heads and lowered them to the ground. The 2 guys continued to look into the darkness, shining the flashlight. In front of them was an empty hall, and they did not see anything. Suddenly, one of the guys, laughing, said that he scared them in vain and there was nothing here. Putting his hand on his belt and looking at his comrade, he told them to go. Why did he stand up? The guy turned around, his body was shaking, and 3 arrows were sticking out of his chest. A second later, the whistle of arrows was heard throughout the dark room, and the guy was stuck with about a dozen arrows. Chuck looked at his dying student in fear. A second later, the flashlight fell to the floor and the other guy jumped back in shock. Looking at the light, screams were heard that where the shots came from, nothing was visible, it was an ambush. The commander, frowning, shouted loudly for no one to move from their place. All the students immediately froze. Chuck turned around and said that that's why he said they don't need to turn on the flashlights. Nate replied that yes, they are attacking in the direction of the light, to which Chuck replied that it was strange, they heard them come in. Why did they attack right away? The protagonist, looking forward, replied that they were playing with their victim. A green goblin appeared from behind a column, laughing maliciously, and Nate continued to say that they wanted to enjoy their fear of death. Chuck raised his axe and then said that they can't fight without seeing the enemy, even if it means they have to take casualties, have to turn on the lights. Nate replied that if they can fight even if they can't see anything. He turned around and asked with a frown that it was possible. The protagonist replied yes. In front of him he added that they should rely on him, then after a few seconds he slowly walked through the room through the students. He advanced quietly, then said that he knew they couldn't see anything, that they were nervous. One of the students was breathing heavily, beads of sweat were rolling down his face. Nate, taking another step, added that he would do everything possible, they should not move or make sounds until he said it was okay. At the same second, one of the students covered his mouth, looking ahead in fear. The protagonist closed his eyes and, lowering his head, thought that he needed to concentrate and remember this feeling again. A system message appeared in his head that concentration was activated. A moment later, he felt many green goblins around him. Then he opened his eyes and turned around abruptly. One of the students, looking ahead in fear, heard the cries of dying goblins. Chuck heard the same thing, looking ahead in confusion. After a while, Nate grabbed the goblin by the neck, said that now it was okay, let him turn on the lights. The whole room was strewn with goblin corpses. He was squeezing the throat of one of them with his right hand, and then he threw him on the floor. The student, looking at this, thought that this was just crazy. What kind of talent did he have? What kind of tricks were these? He looked at the protagonist, who was calmly looking in front of him. Then he gritted his teeth. He thought again that if he had more time, he would destroy them all, that he was constantly standing in his way. He ran up to the protagonist and said that this was just crazy. He had been doing this all his life, but this was the first time he saw a hunter like him. Nate smiled and said that he was just lucky, and they should continue, and then thought that he himself did not know how he did it. They reached a huge door, on top of which hung a huge golden skull of a Ken bull. Then he said that they had arrived. Looking at the giant door, Nate said that they were at the end of the maze. This was the boss room. A huge image of a monster appeared in his head. Chuck raised his head and frowned and said that the boss of the dungeon was behind the door. The protagonist and the guild members were standing near the huge gate. The door was slightly open. People were looking through the crack into the dark room. The old man looked around warily and said that nothing was visible, perhaps another ambush. Nate looked tensely and answered that he was there. He looked at the 2 torches. Light was shining through the door crack. The steps led to the throne with the boss. A buffalo with a human body was looking forward furiously, and the protagonist said that this was the owner of this dungeon. Chuck and the monster glared at each other and the old man said that, as expected, he looked impressive. Nate and Chuck looked away and he said that it did not look like he was going to attack first. They had time to work out a strategy and study the room. A message appeared that the sacrifice of the Minotaur had begun and 5 victims needed to be chosen. The protagonist looked at the screen in surprise and wondered what kind of casualties they were talking about. He looked ahead and listened to Chuck say that the attack group would split into 2 subgroups and thought about how no one but Nate seemed to see it. He put his hand to his chin and looked away thinking that this was a trick. There must be some kind of clue on how to get out of here safely, then it was worth sharing what he learned. He walked up and turned to the old man, but he turned around and said that they were discussing the plan and couldn't it wait. They both frowned and Nate replied that it could have something to do with passing the dungeon, to which the old man objected. The man looked at the guild leader and the protagonist, clenching his hand into a fist. The masked man grinned and thought about how this fool was taking his laurels for himself again. Turning back to them, he walked away deciding that this time he couldn't just stand there with his arms hanging out. The man looked around the corner and looked at the sitting Minotaur. He picked up the crossbow and smiled, thinking that strategies are for losers who beg for mercy and fear, and he was not going to dance to anyone's tune. The man took aim at the monster and thought that now he would show them his F-level shooting talent. 1 shot, and he would get a promotion, a little closer and he would hit the target. He confidently decided that he had crossed the line a little more. The man smiled, thinking that he needed to go 1 step closer. Chuck stood with his hand on his chin, and Nate turned around and looked at him in surprise. He shouted at the man walking with the crossbow to stop. The man turned around and grinned, screaming that he was getting in his way again. He shouted at Nate that he knew that he wanted to take all the laurels for himself. Pulling the crossbow, the man decided that while he was standing idle, he would kill the Minotaur. The man stepped over the edge and Nate ran to stop him. A red warning notification appeared saying that they had entered the center of the labyrinth. 5 victims would be randomly selected. The room shook and energy particles appeared. The man looked up in surprise, not understanding what was happening. Chuck turned to the protagonist standing next to him and shouted that something was wrong with Nate's body. One of the guild's men began to disappear in blue energy and screamed for help and fear. The masked man covered his face with his hand from the stunning blue light. He looked through the mask weakly. The man fell to the ground behind a frightened Chuck, who called him a fool and asked if he understood what he had done. Nate looked ahead in fear and said that he did not think that now was the time to discuss the correctness of decisions. A minotaur with an axe stood in front of the protagonist, Chuck, and 3 other victims. He looked at them furiously. The monster raised his paw and screamed loudly, which shocked the ears of Nate and the old man. The masked man sat on the ground and screamed in fear. There was a purple barrier behind him. He desperately punched the energy wall and screamed to be released immediately. The minotaur stepped forward, breaking through the floor. Chuck frowned in fear and clenched his teeth. The monster quickly ran at the masked man, but the guild leader blocked it with himself. He sat on the ground, looking at the minotaur and holding the man by the scruff of the neck. He grabbed an axe and sternly shouted for everyone to take positions as discussed and no panic. Chuck ran with 2 axes towards the armed minotaur and said to continue attacking with the current number. He would buy some time for everyone to be ready. The old man watched as the monster swung at him. He purposefully ran forward, dodging the blow. The monster hit the ground, and Chuck jumped into the air and said that this was for him to start with. He screamed and attacked the minotaur from above. The 2 men smiled happily, praising the commander and saying that this was top class and maybe they wouldn't be needed here. Nate looked surprised and thought that this was a great hit, a whole other level. Frowning, doubts came to him. Chuck tensed up, looking at the monster. He hit the axe in the chest, but only cracks appeared, which the old man was not happy about. The guild leader was angry and thought that he had steel instead of skin. Nate became alarmed and shouted at him to be careful. The minotaur's blow was approaching the wary Chuck. He pushed off the ground and coughed in pain, jumping into the air. The commander was running furiously with axes in his hands. He frowned and said that it was not that he could not dodge, he just did not need to. Chuck put his hand on his wounded shoulder and said that he only grazed it. The leader looked at the furious minotaur with an axe on his back and decided that he would have to be collected bone by bone. He resolutely shouted to surround him. People from the guild ran to him. They stood with swords on both sides of him, and Chuck told them to avoid direct contact and find his weak points. The protagonist looked at the old man and thought about how he instantly navigated and gave commands, a real veteran of the dungeons, but this is obviously the best they can afford. Nate stood in front of the minotaur, surrounded by dark energy. The protagonist watched as lightning surrounded the monster and thought that he was not even going to go to them, as if the distance meant nothing. Lightning moved along the ground closer to the guy. They enveloped the hand and axe of the monster. Nate looked in fear and recognized lightning. He imagined the god of thunder with a hammer on the back of the minotaur and realized that this was the power of Thor. Chuck stretched his hand forward and shouted that he was up to something and that he needed to be stopped. The leader and the guild members shouted that this was their chance and ran to attack the sparkling monster. Nate became alarmed and shouted that it was dangerous. Chuck tried to strike, saying that he was caught. Lightning came closer to the old man's face and Nate realized that everything was not according to plan. His hand was enveloped in the power of Thor and the protagonist thought that this was a mistake. Suddenly, the protagonist flew up and delivered a powerful kick to the minotaur's face. He clenched his teeth and the minotaur turned away from the pain. The monster's eyes lit up with rage. Nate was surrounded by lightning. He was very afraid. He was struck by the monster's energy and he realized that it was too late. There was a powerful explosion. The protagonist was thrown aside. The man touched the barrier and said that he could not believe it. He watched as the minotaur struck the ground with his axe, with corpses lying around, and said that he had beaten the commander. The 3 people behind the barrier watched the man beat him in fear and discussed how they could never get in. They had never seen anything like it, but they had to help before it was too late. Nate looked at his hand and thought about how he had hit him with all his might, but he didn't care. He was a strong fool. The protagonist lay on the ground, powerless, gritting his teeth, thinking about how after so many years at the bottom, he finally got a talent, saw the light at the end of the tunnel and was dying like this ingloriously. He saw the hilt of a sword near his hand. He looked at it and was surprised. Nate smiled slightly, holding out his hand. The protagonist decided that there was something else they hadn't tried. He stood up, took the sword and said with a smile that if he died like this, he would have no peace. The minotaur raised his axe and looked through the fog at the guy getting up. He grabbed the sword tightly and said that he hadn't tried so hard to die in a place like this. He stood up resolutely and pulled his sword to the side. The monster looked at him furiously. In the reflection of the sword, Nate was visible, who confidently told him to get ready since he was not going to die so easily. A notification about activating the SS level fencing talent appeared. Nate held the sword in front of him, and in front of him stood a formidable monster. The wounded Chuck lay powerless on the floor, thinking that he could not even scratch him with his axes. A man who did not hold a sword in his hands could not put him down. The old man coughed up blood and thought about what he should tell him to run away, but he could not utter a word. In his thoughts, he apologized to the main character. The minotaur ran at Nate, trying to grab him with his paw. The guy quickly swung his sword. Chuck and the guild members looked at it in surprise. The minotaur was shocked, and Nate ran forward. They ran away, and the horn flew into the air. It landed on the floor. The protagonist was serious and determined, thinking that at first it was just excitement, but the moment he took the sword in his hands, confidence came. He remembered how he swung the sword and cut off his horn and decided that he would kill him. Frowning, Nate looked at the sword and thought that he had never seen a real sword before, let alone fought, but he already felt like it was part of his body. He smiled confidently and said that so this is it, the talent for fencing. The monster without one horn bared his teeth furiously. He ran, punching the ground. The Minotaur, full of anger, ran towards the standing protagonist. Nate turned around in surprise. The monster viciously struck. He was surprised, and there were many cuts on his hand. The protagonist ran through the Minotaur that hit the ground. Chuck looked in shock and said that it was incredible, thinking that he made 6 or 7 attacks in an instant. He did not even have time to follow. He looked at the serious Nate with a sword in his hands and thought that he was more in martial arts, and he had been a swordsman all this time. The old man tensed and doubted. Nate leaned over, taking the sword behind the monster's back. He looked at his opponent, determined to win, and the leader decided that he underestimated him. The protagonist looked at the enraged Minotaur with cuts and thought about his thick skin. The man in the mask, holding his head, screamed that he knew he would miscalculate. He could not be defeated with such a level of ability. They are all dead here. Chuck looked back at the upset man at the barrier and thought that this was nonsense. His level of swordsmanship was comparable to the best swordsman of the East. He looked away and decided that Nate was a capable guy. The old man looked at the cracked sword and realized that it would soon break. The protagonist looked at the blade anxiously and said that he swung it a couple of times, and it was no longer good for anything. He clenched his teeth and looked ahead and said that at this rate, he would soon be empty-handed. All he had to do was hit the vital organ on the first try. Nate ran forward purposefully, spreading his arms. The Minotaur swung his fist at the approaching guy. The protagonist dodged and prepared for the blow. He kicked him with all his might and swung his sword, when suddenly a notification about the talent for SS-level battles appeared. Nate looked back and thought in fear that he had not even moved. The Minotaur glared at the tip of the sword near his face. The blade was approaching the monster. Suddenly, Nate hit him from below in the jaw. He extended his leg, and the Minotaur flew into the air. The protagonist exhaled and turned around. He caught the falling sword. Nate was flying at chest level with the sword in his hands, saying that he was caught. A message appeared about using the SS-level swordsmanship talent. The monster glared at him. Nate looked at him in fear. The Minotaur hit the ground with all his might while the protagonist was in the air. The guy landed on one knee and held the sword in front of him, grinning. He looked at the badly cracked blade. Nate frowned and realized that just a little more and the sword would break, and there was no point in fighting with bare hands. The next blow was his last chance. He watched as the furious Minotaur sat on his knees and thought that he needed an opportunity. It dawned on the protagonist. He smiled happily. Thor's power enveloped the room again and the opponents stood opposite each other. Chuck closed himself from the glow and squinted, thinking that this was something he had already used. He looked forward in surprise. Nate was enveloped in dark energy and he held the sword fiercely. The old man looked in shock and thought that he was going to go ahead. They both filled with energy and were ready to fight. The protagonist's sword was enveloped in yellow flames. Chuck stood up and rubbing his chin said that he had to help somehow. He was surprised and remembered how Nate told him that they could fight even if they could not see anything. The old man called the frightened man sitting on the floor. He screamed, holding his head tightly. Chuck told him with a smile that he had a good thing in store. This was his chance and asked if he would try. Nate held the blade, running his other hand along the tip. He touched the tip of the sword with his fingers, aiming at the Minotaur and saying that he had only one chance. He swung and said that he had to hit a vital organ on the first try. The monster clenched his teeth in fury. They looked at each other confidently. The rivals continued to look furiously. There was an explosion that pierced the ground. Nate ran purposefully towards the enemy, holding the sword. They rushed towards each other surrounded by lightning. The protagonist and the Minotaur were preparing to strike. Nate swung his sword furiously. The guy struck, spreading his legs, while the monster swung the axe with all his might. He noticed the broken sword above his head. Nate looked at the broken piece in surprise. He held it tightly by the handle and thought about the fact that it was broken. The Minotaur opened his mouth menacingly and screamed. The protagonist bowed his head in despair and threw the broken sword to the ground. The monster tried to hit Nate, who stretched his hand back. A new blade flew towards him, which he grabbed tightly. The protagonist ran up and swung. Behind him was a man who threw the sword and he said with a smile that this was the end for the Minotaur. The man in the mask extended his hand and shouted for the newcomer to finish him off. The monster tried to hit Nate with an axe, but he got ahead of him, piercing his stomach. The news showed a crowd of people near the portal to the dungeon and said that 5 hours had passed since the last monster appeared from the dungeon. As soon as new details appeared, they would immediately report. The man with the microphone looked around in surprise. He pointed to the dungeon and cried out that someone was coming. Nate carried Chuck on his shoulders and happily said that it was now light. They finally got out. The protagonist looked at the old man and asked why he was so sure that he would catch the sword. The guild leader introduced Nate and said that he wasn't. He just remembered how he said that you can fight when you can't see anything, and wouldn't he have been able to catch a dagger flying out of nowhere, so he took the risk. The guy scratched his head and laughed sheepishly, saying that if he hadn't caught it, he would have let everyone down. In any case, they survived thanks to the old man. Chuck looked back at him and said that it wasn't so. All the guild members looked at the confused Nate with a smile, and the leader said that it was he who saved them. He patted him on the back and asked what he was worth. The guys were standing at the exit of the portal and looking at the crowd of people. Chuck said that people were waiting, and he made the biggest contribution to this cleanup, so he should tell the people. The main character looked back in surprise and asked if he made the biggest contribution. Chuck closed his eyes and smiled. Nate imagined the people in suits making fun of him, the chains that bound him, the swearing on the phone, and thinking that he had been looked down upon his whole life for his lack of talent. He remembered screaming in pain and sitting alone, and deciding that he was no longer the same. The protagonist pressed his lips together, holding back tears. He raised his hand. Nate and the guild walked out of the dungeon, and the people on the street also raised their hands in joy. The night sky illuminated the multi-story building of Sammonseongsim University Hospital. Many people are sitting in line on the seats at the register. Nate looks out from behind the curtain, looking at his mother's face. He closes his eyes in relief, saying that thank God his mother is safe. Looking at the loudspeaker, the guy hears someone broadcasting information that they will talk to a person who made a small contribution to clearing the dungeon that appeared in the middle of the city. The media channel shows a video of the main character, who with a smile answers the host's questions about how everything went and how he feels, adding that the clearing went so quickly and really there were no difficulties. The guy, confused, puts his hands forward, listening to the host's questions about where he is from and what his name is, that they have not heard of the couple yet and what guild he is from. And is it true that he is at a fairly high level of both sword and martial arts, to which the guy only tries to say his name, but at the same time asks him to ask questions more slowly. Nate sighed from fatigue. On the TV show, holding his neck with his hand, the guy says that where I am from and his guild does not matter, and several times they faced danger, but he fought to protect someone dear to him. To which the host begins to ask questions about what the hero wants to say. There is no need for guild, and lately there have been discussions about the arrogant behavior of the hunter community. The goal was to criticize the World Union of Hunters. The guy abruptly turned off the TV, holding the remote in his hand with an awkward face, saying what a shame it is, and he cannot watch this anymore. The guy's gaze goes elsewhere, holding a broken phone with information. He asks when they managed to film it, and in this chaos, the journalists scare him when they manage to film something. Suddenly, the protagonist's eyes widen in shock. A notification appears stating that he, a low-level god, has gained popularity, and his divine power increases to 1000, causing the guy to ask exclamation questions. Holding his hand on his chin, the guy looks forward, asking if it was the divine power that was written in the vacancies. A new notification appears stating that since the hero has received 1000 points of divine power, he can post a new job search ad, to which the hero again says the word exactly. Pointing his finger at the command to continue, Nate says that he is taking the bull by the horns, and of course he will continue. Suddenly, a notification appeared again, saying that the Hephaestus Forge is recruiting security managers. The employer is Hephaestus, the divine power is over 1000, no work experience is required, and fights are possible to some extent. Looking at the notification with interest and a smile, the hero says that a security manager is not bad, and so it seems like nothing complicated. Stretching in a chair, the protagonist says that he ran around a bit today and he will go home, take a rest, and then return to work. Unexpectedly, a notification glowing red informs that 3 gods have already sent their resumes for this vacancy, and it will soon be closed. Taking the notification in his hands with his mouth open, the guy loudly asks the word what. Pressing his finger on the respond command, the guy says that nothing like that will happen, and this ridiculous job will be his. Suddenly, a blue light begins to shine from the window of the building, piercing the shadow of the night through and through. The screams of the protagonist are heard against the background of the blue light. He fell to the ground, holding his hand on his heart, asking himself if it was really impossible to organize some kind of transfer more smoothly. Sitting in front of the building with a huge ball burning with fire magic, he asks that he got to the right place, and this is the Forge of Hephaestus. Looking forward with anger and sweat running down his face, the hero thinks about how hot it is there. Suddenly, a large tan man appears behind Nate, smiling and asking the guy if he is new, to which the hero answers positively, adding that it is as if he is in a sauna and is about to boil, asking the man what they have here. They haven't invented air conditioners. Turning his gaze to the guy, the man introduces himself as Hephaestus, the owner of this forge. Quickly turning to face the man and bowing sharply, Nate tells the god that he is very pleased to meet him, and his name is Nate, and he came to apply for a job as a security manager, to which Hephaestus, laughing, asks the guy why he greets like a human. Making a crazy, scared face with his eyes wide open, Nate wonders in his thoughts what he heard and what he should do. The tan man touched his chin with his hand with a smile on his face. The man, raising his fist over the main character, tells him with a smile that the rumors are true after all, and history tells us that Hephaestus is the patron saint of blacksmithing and the god of fire. Leaving his shadow on the small body of the main character, Hephaestus talks about the god of the mountain, who, out of love for mere mortals, so fearlessly fought monsters in Thor's dungeon along with people. Laughing again, the man says that it is no wonder that their hot-tempered Thor was imbued with the hero, adding that he is no slouch, to which Nate, standing in front of the man, touches his head with his hand, thinking that it seems he did not hear anything. Laughing again, Hephaestus asks the guy who just leaned over that he needs to install an air conditioner in the forge, to which the guy quickly apologizes. Standing with his back to the guy, the god tells him that enough greetings, and he will tell him about the work. A horn appears in the man's hand, to which he says with a smile that it is better to see once than to hear 100 times, and now he will understand everything himself. Putting the horn to his lips, Hephaestus warns that it may be a little loud. He blows air into the instrument with all his might, from which the strongest roar rushed. Nate covered his ears with both hands from the excessive volume, opening his mouth. Decent men run out from the other side of the hall. They kneel before the god, asking him what he called them, to which Hephaestus tells the guy that here they are. Taking Nate by the shoulder with one hand and pushing him towards the dwarves, the god introduces them that here is their manager for the day, and let them say hello, to which the dwarves all say in unison that the dwarves greet the guy, and they are glad to serve him. Holding his neck with his hand, the guy says with a slight smile that he has never worked in a forge, but he will try. Standing next to the guy holding his neck, the tan man laughs, telling the guy why he is being modest, and newbies can be good too, to which the protagonist replies that it means everything is easier than he thought. Hephaestus leans towards the protagonist's ear, whispering to him that these comrades are certainly hard-working, only their hands are naughty, and there are problems with them, and they are like small dogs. They seem small, but much more evil than big dogs. Introducing a chihuahua, the protagonist asks himself in his head how this happens. Hephaestus, remembering the moment when he was wearing a column and then noticed the pendant missing from its place, says that if he gets distracted, something will disappear, like last week, for example, the pendant that he wanted to give to Freya, the goddess of beauty and love. Looking in shock at the god covering his face with his hand, Nate asks that they even steal things from her, to which the man replies that this is the whole problem. Looking at the noble bearded man, Nate thinks about something that you can't tell from looking at him. Putting his hands in a bag, Hephaestus says that today he needs to go to Olympus, and he thinks that nothing terrible will happen here without him, saying that he gives this thing just in case. The protagonist, glorifying an incomprehensible weapon, asks the god what it is. Eudaimoni tells that this is the club of Hercules, made of olive wood, and a replica of the club with which Hercules defeated the Nemean lion, effect 10% chance of stunning. The guy's mouth fell open from the information he saw. Straining with his eyes wide open, the guy asks himself if this is too much. Creating a small portal with his hand with a smile, the god wants to say something. Holding a huge portal in front of him, he stands next to the guy. Waving his large hand at Nate with a smile, Hephaestus tells him that he is going, and he entrusts him with his forge, the god of the mountain. Shielding his face from the light of the portal with his hand, Nate shouts at him to stop, telling him that he never said what to do, asking why he should leave him with this club, and what he should do at all. With wild eyes and a smile, the god asks the guy why he is asking him. Looking at the scared guy, with 3 monstrous faces behind him, he says that as long as the guy is stronger than them, then everything will be fine, and they are much weaker than Nate thinks. Making a fake smile, the protagonist turns back, telling the dwarves that they still haven't introduced themselves to each other. Looking at the angry face of the dwarf, the guy asks him that he is glad to meet him. Looking ahead and imagining the moment when he was holding the wooden club, Nate thinks that he knew that this could happen. That's why he gave him the Hercules club. Smiling, slowly opening his mouth, the protagonist suggests to the dwarf gentleman that they just relax. Lowering his face, he says that he was just given a cool weapon. Standing in a cool pose with the Hercules club in his hand, he continues to say that it can hurt the dwarves a lot. Suddenly, the dwarves pointed 4 firearms at the guy's body. The guy's face fell into shock and confusion. The dwarf holds a large cigar in his hands. Looking at him with an animalistic look, he says goodbye to the hero in Spanish. Nate, opening his eyes, hears the dwarves talking about what they were doing here, because the shift ended a long time ago, to which the others answer that it's enough for the other to be smart, and they stayed for a short time, and he will share his paycheck with his comrade, to which the main character asks that he is alive. He sees 2 silhouettes of dwarves with red hair, and another holding something on a rope, to which the red-haired man asks what it is, and the other answers that this necklace was made by Hephaestus, and he heard that he was going to give it to the goddess Freya, and if you sell it, you can get rich. Gritting his teeth and looking to the side, the guy begins to swear. He realizes that his hands are tied with a rope to a column. 2 gnomes pay attention to the guy sitting by the column, to which one with a bald head asks that the boy has already woken up earlier than they thought, and the other says that they gave him a lot of sleeping pills. And is this guy also a god? Suddenly, the guy, against the background of the gnomes, tells them that they are fearless. Imagining a scary silhouette of a man on a red background against the background of the gnomes, he asks the gnomes what they were thinking, what the consequences will be, after what they did to one of the main gods of Olympus in his own forge. Looking at the pumped up arms of the gnomes, Nate tells them that he is giving them one last chance, before it is too late, and it is better for them to untie him. At that moment, the gnomes, holding their stomachs and chests, begin to laugh until they cry. Opening his eyes, the guy looks at them, listening to their questions about what he thought to scare them with Hephaestus, and if they were afraid of him, they would not have done anything. The gnomes, holding a machine gun, turn their attention to their bald comrade, coming from around the corner, who says that they took everything valuable and need to slowly leave, to which the men say that this is great, and he will pump this guy with sleeping pills and catch up. The main character holds knives in his hands, cutting the ropes tying his hands. The gnome's legs are opposite the guy sitting by the column, to which they tell him that such idiots come for a part-time job, and they did not think that everything would work out so easily for them. Lowering his head down in front of the smiling gnome, Nate tells them that they will regret this. The red-haired gnome, making a face in front of his laughing friend, tells him, imitating Nate, that they will regret it, to which the other gnome laughingly says how bad they are. Listening to the gnome's laughter, the ropes fall off the guy's hands. Taking Hercules' weapon in his hand, the guy continues to say that he has already said everything. The dwarves look at the main character in shock. He hits them with his mace with all his might, repeating that they will regret it. Looking at the beaten, tied-up dwarves, Nate says that they have had enough. Fanning himself with his hand against the background of the trembling bodies of the dwarves, the guy says that they forced him to resort to violence. Pulling his jacket off his hand and exposing his sword under the jacket, he says that he would have gotten into deep trouble if he had not asked Duke for it. Remembering the words of the blonde girl in the hood that it would not hurt him to have a sword, or even two, Nate says that he often remembers her words, and if they meet, he will need to say thank you to her. The guy's gaze moved to the other side. He sees Hephaestus' necklace for Freya in the gnome's hand. A man shakes steel ingots into a box. A bald dwarf, standing near the ingots, shouts to his boss that they have loaded all the ingots. A man with his hands folded on the weights and a cigarette in his mouth listens as the dwarf says that they have also put down their weapons, and that is all, to which he responds positively. The blonde dwarf shouts to everyone, attracting their attention. Looking at the two bald dwarves looking at the ingots, he tells them to come to their senses. Pointing his finger at the man in the shirt and pants standing at the top of the stairs, he says that their boss, the Fiery Fist, wants to say something, asking everyone to concentrate. The dwarf in the shirt, standing in front of a group of bald dwarves, calls them brothers, saying that they are a people endowed with the spirit of the flaming mountains. The protagonist's hand clings to a stone. He looks at the standing bald dwarves, listening to the chief's speech about how they are the best miners and brave warriors. Holding a cigarette in his teeth and his hand in the air, his mouth open with emotion, the Fire Fist tells them that they do not work for free, but they have pride. The dwarves listen to the chief's speech with tears, asking about when they were treated the way they deserved. Holding a cigarette in his teeth, the man shouts that the owner of this place, Hephaestus, humiliated them, and today they will pay for the disrespect they received. Raising the crowd to a platoon, the Fire Fist shouts that they will take revenge on Hephaestus. The guy, hiding behind the wall, hears the exclamations of the dwarves about how they will take revenge on Hef, thinking about what kind of army of heads this is, and they are swarming like ants. Suddenly, the wall behind which the guy was hiding comes down completely, at which point bald gnomes start looking at him, and Nate, out of fear and surprise, starts asking them about how strange the weather is. At that moment, the bald gnomes arm themselves with firearms, looking at the main character with a creepy look. The guy jumps up from the hasty shots fired in his direction, and runs screaming behind the column. Sitting behind it and hiding from the bullets, the guy asks himself what kind of gnomes these are, and they are shooting left and right. Looking at the image of the frightening men reloading their machine guns,